Friends, welcome to another Pints with Jack Skype session, where, as always, I am joined by my dear friend, David. David, thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much.
We've got that down packed now, clearly. And for listeners who don't know, we run a podcast every single week, so go check that out, Pints with Jack. And this is where we break away from that and are usually inspired by something that we talked about on the podcast, but we like to keep that tight, concise, and I love to mess with David on this by having something unplanned and free-flowing conversation. But
it hurts my terpe personality.
It does. But we are in quarantine state right now, and so David and I are drinking quarantinis.
So this is emergency and gin and lots and lots of ice, but it's mostly melted at this point.
Yes.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Vitamin goodness.
Vitamins and minerals. I loved that from my time at Oxford. So this was quite the chapter. We've been building in this book. We've been reading. We're in part 2. There's a couple chapters left. Everything is coming full circle. And there was this... Yes, we're in chapter 2 of part 2. And so this is...
And there's 2 to go. 2 to go. So I'm interested as to how all of this is going to wrap up.
So am I. Because this one, actually in great part due to your heavy lifting of connecting this to some mere Christianity, took us full circle. But before getting to that, let me just provide a little bit of context with this to kick off this conversation. So much of this book has been about this false self. And we've watched her build up this, call it armor defense, that led to becoming the queen and putting to bed her shame, Orwell. We've seen parts where she locks up Psyche in her mind. So there's just been this locking up and putting on armor in walls. Well, there's this scene where she's in bed and her father comes to her in a dream, and she goes to the pillar room, which is symbolic, but no point in unpacking that here. And then she is supposed to dig to a different layer and goes to the pillar room, but yet a layer deeper in earth. Then digs a hole again and descends into the same room, but even deeper. And so she does this process of getting deeper and deeper. And it's very symbolic of this peeling off these labels or these layers of this false self. And so as language we've been using is coming full circle here because somewhat I've been applying it on top of it. So I'm curious, David, what you're making of this now as this starts to unpack.
I think we're starting to see the conversion of Orwell. In the chapter we've just read, she seems to have reached a point of conversion. She is no longer a rebel. She is willing to lay down her arms. And I didn't mention it in the episode, but it really reminded me of something that Lewis wrote about his own conversion in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. He writes this: "The odd thing was that before God closed in on me, I was in fact offered what now appears a moment of wholly free choice. I was going up the Headington Hill on top of a bus. Without words, and I think almost without images, a fact about myself was somehow presented to me. I became aware that I was holding something at bay, or shutting something out, or, if you like, I was wearing some stiff clothing, like corsets, or even a suit of armor, as if I were a lobster. I felt myself being, there and then, given a free choice. I could open the door, or keep it shut. I could unbuckle the armor, or keep it on." And ultimately, Lewis unbuckles his armor and allows God to move. And I think Orwell is now at that point, because when she encounters the God for a second time at a different body of water, she even notes that he found no rebel. It was the same God, same voice, but I had changed.
Yeah, she needed to, and I like that you use the word rebel, because in the podcast you brought up that quote from Mere Christianity of how we are like these rebel men and we have to lay down our arms and surrender.
Would you like me to read it?
Yeah, you read that. Bring it in early. Let's do it.
Okay. So this is a Mere Christianity. I think this is the chapter, The Perfect Penitent. Lewis writes, "Man had tried to set himself up on his own, to behave as if he belonged to himself. In other words, fallen man is not simply an imperfect creature who needs improvement. He is a rebel who must lay down his arms. Laying down your arms, surrendering, saying you're sorry, realizing that you have been on the wrong track, and getting ready to start life over again from the ground floor. That is the only way out of a hole. This process of surrender, this movement full speed astern, is what Christians call repentance. Now, repentance is no fun at all. It is something much harder than merely eating humble pie. It means unlearning all the self-conceit and self-will that we've been training ourselves into for thousands of years. It means killing part of yourself, undergoing a kind of death.
So I want to start with, there's a few different main points I want us to go down with this that are coming to me. But the first one that I want to make here is we've talked a bit about the process of going from the false self to true self. So we've set up through these Skype sessions, through some of the blog posts, what the false self is, these behavioral patterns that we've learned. Lewis even mentions that in this chapter, this self-conceit that we've built up. You have suggested on a couple of these sessions, how do we go from that to the true self? And we've suggested that silence, that solitude, Henry Nouwen, The Life of the Beloved. We've suggested, in our case, from the Catholic tradition, the Mass, receiving Christ into us, the Eucharist, that theosis, ultimately, which goes to mere Christianity. When we allow Christ to form within us, we become more fully and authentically ourselves. Lewis is offering something here that's just very practical, where he's essentially saying you have to go back and undo a lot of these behavioral patterns that you did up, I guess, if that's the proper language.
You trained yourself in.
Yes.
This is the screw tape letters.
Yes.
You've got to undo all of the training that you've allowed screw tape to train you to do.
Yes.
And to then begin forming virtue. But the thing is, all of this begins with laying down your arms. Mm-hmm. In the podcast, I spoke about the Beatitudes. And the first Beatitude is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It begins with declaring our spiritual bankruptcy, our utter dependence upon God, knowing that we are in a state and we need his help to get out of it.
And would you say it begins with truth? And what I mean by truth is a true self-awareness that you need to lay down your arms. Because if you think of Orwell, she's lived all of part 1 in denial. And then chapter 1 of part 2, she realizes she had a devouring love. Now she's realizing when she descended to the bottom of this pillar room that she is Ungit. And in the book, for people who are just watching this one off, this Ungit character to her is a devouring God that takes love away. And so she's realizing she's been this devouring, she's a spider, and Gloam has been this web, and she's just gone all over it. And that is a deep realization of her brokenness, which just brings us to the next point that I want to get your thoughts on. That really was mind-blowing to me here. The importance of, sometimes we think the true self, I think there's two parts to true self. Part of the true self is a good thing. It's like, who's David before you built up these patterns of the world to win love? So it almost makes it sound like there's like this true David that's good and beautiful. But I also think part of the true self is recognize you are incredibly broken. Like, that's what we're seeing here. Her true self is, at her core, she is Ungit. And I think in our spiritual journey, I'm genuinely curious if you want to either contradict this or agree with this, there comes a point where we have to recognize our true self is actually to some degree morally bankrupt. And it's very easy, and I've experienced this even within my personal tradition, the Catholic tradition, of doing all of these practices that make me feel like I'm a good person. But still at the core, I am deeply broken. Those are the things giving me the grace to get healing, but I am still a deeply broken person. And we've been talking about this quarantine stuff. I've been failing my spiritual routines this last couple of weeks because I need the Eucharist. Like these years of putting on these good routines, these good practices are all falling apart without the source and sustenance that I need that gives me the grace and strength to be the person I can become. Like, I am bankrupt without Christ.
I completely agree. I wouldn't quite call it moral bankruptcy, spiritual bankruptcy.
Yeah, strong word.
I wouldn't disagree with it too much. I just think spiritual bankruptcy incorporates a whole load of more stuff to know that we come to God as spiritual beggars, that we come broken. This is back to your post, Broken and Beautiful. The idea that we come to God broken, but that he can enter into that brokenness and transform it. I think there's a real balancing act that we have to do here, because we don't want to err on one side or the other. That we come to God broken, but that also we need to remember that we are made in his image and likeness. But there's a line in Prince Caspian, which was the Narnian book we read last season, where Aslan says, "You come from the Lord Adam and Lady Eve, and that is both honor enough to erect the head of the poorest beggar and shame enough to bow the shoulders of the greatest emperor on earth. Be content."
Wow.
So we need to remember that we are made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore good. But we need to recognize that we're also broken, that we're lacking a communion with God that we were built for.
And I want to,
and repentance is a recognition of that truth.
and I want to point out a bit. It's not meant to be when we talk about. I'm glad you brought up this balance, because it's not meant to be when we understand we're spiritually bankrupt and we're broken. It's not meant to be a place of despair. It's a starting point in the process of theosis and Christ formation within you, and accepting that sonship and allowing the renewal and restoration. I love those two R's. They're in the New Testament. Renewing our minds and our hearts. It's to know that that's just a starting point, and Christ won't leave us there. And as Lewis says in Mere Christianity, he will make you perfect. It's like the dentist that goes in, pulls out a tooth, and then finds all these other issues. That's just the starting point. And I want us to stress that.
This is the point that the son, in the parable of the prodigal son, this recognition is what makes him get up and turn towards home.
Yes.
Because he has a father there that loves him, even if he doesn't yet understand quite how much.
All right, now I want us to finish with the importance of this, because, well, I won't say the because yet. So can you read that quote that you read of the Eastern Orthodox monastery in Mount Athos?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll read what the God of the Mountain says first of all.
Okay.
So, Orwell, she's going to kill herself, and the God says, "Do not do it. You cannot escape Ungit by going into the Deadlands, for she is there also. Die before you die. There is no chance after." And in the episode, I commented that there is a monastery on Mount Athos, an Eastern Orthodox monastery, where over the gateway, there's inscribed an epigram that says, "If you die before you die, then when you die, you won't die." Oh, good grief. I said that wrong.
You can say it again, and we're not going to
what,
cut this out.
All right, fine. If you die before you die, then when you die, you won't really die.
And that's so important, because, again, you and I probably have not stressed this point in a while. I might have been since the first chapter of since Mere Christianity, but maybe a bit in the Great Divorce. The idea that this Christian journey is not about winning God's love. It's not even about like doing enough stuff to get into heaven. It's about becoming a person that dies to your old self and puts on Christ. It's putting to bed your ego, your pride. That's the whole point of the Christian journey. And we've talked about how the Son of God became man so men can become sons of God. Lewis says that's the whole point of the Christian journey. These aren't two different things. Once you put to bed that ego and let Christ form within you and renew your mind, renew your heart, you become your true self. You become divine to some degree. You participate in the divine life. I can say that more strongly.
And you find that all the things that you gave up and that you killed are not really lost.
Yes.
Because all the things that they were an imitation of, you find their true reality. This has been the lesson of the Great Divorce. You're not allowed to take your sinful souvenirs with you into heaven. Mm-hmm. You have to rip out your eye, cut off your arm. But you find that then when you come to heaven, that you actually didn't lose anything.
Think of the lizard becoming a stallion. I mean, that's...
In fact, there it becomes the very means of his entry into the highlands of heaven.
That's exactly right. My mind is racing. I like to keep these not too long because people already can listen to us on a podcast for 50 minutes. They don't need to listen to us for 20 on a YouTube channel. But anything else, any thoughts that you have here before we wrap this up?
Die before you die.
Die before you die. That's going to be the title of this. I love it. Well, thanks for joining, David. Thanks for providing your wisdom. As always, stay healthy and safe in this quarantine by drinking more quarantini.
Wash your hands as well. Cheers.
Wash your hands, drink quarantinis.